here with news about the Chinese spy balloon that was finally shot down, floating over the United States, doing God knows what, and which the utterly neutered and compromised Biden administration was too timid, incompetent, and quite possibly paid off to do anything about for days. Now, if you've been following it, here's a little recap of what happened with this balloon. On Friday, a giant Chinese spy balloon, presumably launched by the People's Liberation Army or some other Beijing intelligence outfit, was sighted over the American Midwest, with all sorts of equipment and cameras and God knows what else hanging off it to scoop up as much data, information, and signal intelligence as it could. Yet, while the balloon went public after eagle-eyed members of the American people spotted it, according to Bloomberg, the Biden administration had known about the balloon floating over American territory for an entire week, first hearing about it on the 28th of January. But gosh, they didn't tell anyone because they were hoping no one would look up from their phones and notice. But once people did figure out what was going on, it became a PR nightmare for the Pentagon, which had to come clean about the Chinese, what the Chinese called a wayward weather balloon. Yeah, right, in American airspace. Quote, clearly the intent of this balloon is for surveillance, the Pentagon confirmed to journalists on Friday, Australian time. Well, solved the case there, Sherlock. And indeed, it was pretty obviously not a Sunrise Hunter Valley Champagne breakfast hot air balloon trip that got blown off course by La Nina. Now, I don't know about you, but I kind of think that there's a pretty obvious solution to the problem of a big unmanned spy craft floating over your country's interior. And it can be summed up in 2 words: target practice. Yet the Biden administration let this thing float around for days before taking the obvious route here and made this poor general go out before the press and act like the whole thing was no big deal.
And this is something that NORAD is closely monitoring. We do assess at this time that it does not pose a physical threat, as I mentioned, to people on the ground. So we'll just leave it at that.
No physical threat to people on the ground. Well, look, maybe not now, but what if the intelligence that it picks up, I don't know, maybe helps the Chinese in some future conflict with the United States? I mean, you don't have to be Sun Tzu here or General Clausewitz to know that when your enemy is gathering information on you, the aim is to cause physical harm to people on the ground. That's the whole point. And let's note that the balloon wasn't just hovering over cattle properties, but it was also over the 341st Missile Wing at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, which just happens to be home to a field of 150 nuclear-tipped ICBMs. No reason why you'd want to be spying over that, is there? Anyway, let's go back to the briefing, where some of the journalists were curious if the Pentagon might do the obvious thing, this is before they shot it down, and shoot down the balloon.
Close was the U.S. to ordering was the president to ordering a shoot down of the balloon?
Yeah, so again, I'm not going to get into internal discussions within the White House. Again, right now we assess that there is no threat, a physical threat or military threat to people on the ground. So we're continuing to monitor, and we'll just leave it at that.
Seriously, the balloon was floating over plains and cornfields, and the chances the wreckage would come down and crush a tour group enjoying the spectacles of the World Museum of Mining in Butte, Montana, was about as high as Chris Bowen getting up tomorrow morning to announce Australia is going nuclear. But nevertheless, all of this risk calculation went without taking into account what could be learned by finding out what the Chinese had loaded up on this balloon by bringing it down to Earth. I mean, look, I watched this poor general go around the traps on this for half an hour, and after a little while, I began to feel sorry for him. I mean, imagine being a career officer. You've spent your entire career rising to the rank of general. You're sworn to defend your country, and your president has sent you out to defend not shooting down a balloon that is illegally over your territory, spying on your nation.
Yesterday, a senior defense official said that the intelligence gathering capability of this balloon will be no better than any Chinese satellite in a low Earth orbit. If that's the case, why would Beijing go through the trouble and expense to send this balloon on such a journey?
Yeah, I'd have to refer you back to the PRC on that.
Any opinion why?
Again, look, we're monitoring this. As I mentioned, it's violated U.S. airspace. It's violated international law. We've communicated that back to the government of China. But again, I'd refer you back to China in terms of.
I tell you what, if I was a general, I'd surely be tempted to give this sort of job of spinning to one of my lieutenants, at least.
All right, move on. Nothing to see here. Please disperse.
And that's what essentially General Ryder was forced to say. Move along. It's just a Chinese spy balloon illegally over an American nuclear missile field. Nothing to see here. But where the general deliberately failed to give us any insights, I think the reporter who asked that last question was onto something, perhaps inadvertently. Let's listen to that question again.
Yesterday, a senior defense official said that the intelligence gathering capability of this balloon will be no better than any Chinese satellite in a low Earth orbit. If that's the case, why would Beijing go through the trouble and expense to send this balloon on such a journey?
Well, look, I think the answer is quite simple. Why would they bother? Because they can. Because by doing so, the Chinese, whose culture is very much about honor and face, is mocking the United States and the Biden administration, saying, look, we can fly a balloon right over the heart of your nation, and you can't do anything about it because you're too weak and you're too compromised. The Chinese know that they've got Biden exactly where they want him, and they have had him there for years. The evidence is clear that China has tried to corrupt, perhaps successfully, the Biden family and many, many other Washington institutions through massive infiltration campaigns. We know Hunter was doing very lucrative work, if work is the right word for what he was doing, for Chinese-linked entities. Millions of dollars have flowed to Joe Biden's vice presidential think tank, who knew there was such a thing, from Beijing. And of course, we have all heard about Joe Biden's statements from China over the years.
China is not our enemy.
I believe then, and I'm even more convinced now, that a rising China is an incredibly positive development for not only China, but the United States and the rest of the world. It is in our self-interest that China continue to prosper. China is a great nation, and we should hope for the continued expansion. We want to see China rise. A rising China can be a significant asset for the region and the world. China is going to eat our lunch. Come on, man. They're not bad folks, but guess what? They're not competition for us. China's not our problem. We can help them with some of their problems. China's not a problem. The idea that China is going to eat our lunch is bizarre. And so, what are we worried about?
Yeah, what are we worried about? Come on, man. Now, the Biden administration has finally shot the spy balloon down off the Carolina coast and taken the huge step, oh, this is massive, of delaying a trip by Secretary of State Anthony Blinken to China. That'll learn him. But other than that, well, that's right, nothing. And you know this would never have happened if Trump or anybody else with a spine was in office. And you know the U.S. would also never attempt something so audacious over the Chinese mainland. And don't think they're not noticing all this in Beijing.